Until this one. In a moment watched by billions, a veteran guard stepped forward, halberd in hand, and shattered centuries of protocol. Was it a mistake, a threat, a betrayal, or something far more human? Before we reveal the moment that sent shockwaves through the Vatican, press the subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Born to a tailor in Bern, Matteo grew up around straight lines and quiet discipline. A crooked seam, his father often said, can destroy a suit. People notice the floor before the fabric. Matteo took those words in like scripture. He hadn't always intended to serve in Rome. His grandfather had served in the Swiss Guard during John Paul II's papacy. His portrait hung in the family's entryway, halberd in hand, jaw set, gaze like marble. Legacy called to him. At 22, Matteo applied to the Guard and passed every test with cold efficiency. Within 3 years, he was selected for ceremonial duty, a post reserved for those who could stand unmoving for hours. He wore the red, blue, and yellow uniform with pride. Not vanity, pride. He represented centuries of fidelity, of quiet strength. His record was unblemished, not a single mark of tardiness, not a missed salute. Once, during a brutal August heat wave, a junior guard collapsed beside him. Matteo didn't flinch. Protocol was clear. Hold position until relieved. "Swingley's not a man," someone had once muttered. "He's a metronome with lungs." It wasn't that Matteo lacked emotion. He simply believed that restraint was a form of respect. The only person who ever saw through that surface was his sister Lena. When they were children, she would drape curtains over his shoulders and make him guard the living room while she played queen. He never smiled, but he never refused. Lena died when Matteo was 19. Appendicitis, misdiagnosed as a stomach bug. The nurse who hesitated, the doctor who waited for a form. Matteo never forgot those moments. He learned then that protocol wasn't always the safest thing to cling to. That same winter, he applied to the Swiss Guard. 13 years later, the silence remained. Matteo was the kind of man Vatican photographers loved. Tall, symmetrical, his posture textbook perfect. Most assumed he was decorative. They didn't realize he had once disarmed a man outside the apostolic palace with nothing but a sidestep and wrist lock. His job was not to be seen. It was to be remembered only in the stillness of the frame, but sometimes even stone cracks. And on the day Pope Leo XIV stepped out into the light of his inauguration, that's exactly what happened. They said his election was an accident, a compromise candidate, too young, too modern, too unknown. But when the white smoke curled above the Sistine Chapel, it was Cardinal Joe Luis Santiago of Brazil who stepped onto the balcony as Leo XIV. No one had expected it. The last Leo had reigned over 100 years ago, a conservative, intellectual, who once declared modernism a plague upon the church. But Santiago was different. He had come from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, where he had washed the feet of drug addicts and held confession in shipping containers. Matteo watched the announcement from the barracks common room, surrounded by his fellow guards. When the new pope appeared on the balcony, there was a moment of confused silence. Then someone muttered, "That's not the man they wanted." But it was the man the conclave had chosen. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't part of the tight Roman inner circle. He was, in a way, clean. And in the aftermath of scandals, the church needed clean. Inside the Vatican, whispers floated on the marble corridors. Cardinals who wore their disappointment as tightly as their crimson sashes, bureaucrats who found his informality threatening, security heads concerned that a man who refused bulletproof glass might not survive long enough to bring change. But Matteo noticed something else in Leo's eyes. Clarity. Not confidence exactly, but conviction. The look of a man who knew the weight he had just accepted and had decided quietly to carry it anyway. The days following the election were a flurry of preparations. Yet, with every new briefing, Leo disrupted expectations. He declined the traditional throne and requested a wooden chair. He shortened the ceremonial walk. He refused to wear red slippers, opting instead for worn brown leather shoes from Brazil. The master of ceremonies nearly fainted when the Pope suggested speaking off script during the Mass. "He's simplifying things to the point of rupture," the commandant muttered. "It's not just style. He's dismantling scaffolding." Still the orders came, and the Swiss Guard obeyed. Matteo, as always, took the changes in stride, but something in him stirred just beneath the polished surface. Not resistance, not admiration either. Something harder to name. Curiosity, maybe. The morning of the inauguration began in silence. Matteo rose before the bells, dressing with muscle memory. Trousers, shirt, chainmail, tunic, belt, everything locked into place like pieces of architecture. The guard was called to the lower hall for final instructions. Commandant Alrek stood at the front, rigid, white-haired, square-jawed, with a voice like gravel. "You are not security," he began slowly, firmly. A pause. His boots tapped once on the floor. "You are not security." The silence that followed was more loaded than any shout. "You are symbols. Living statues. You will stand at exact intervals. You will not react. You will not deviate. If someone collapses near you, you do not move. If a camera flashes in your eye, you do not move. If a child screams, if a dog barks, if thunder splits the sky," he paused, "you do not move." His eyes scanned the room. "If one of you flinches, it will be remembered longer than the homily." Matteo stood in the third row. His face was neutral, but his mind recorded every word with surgical clarity. By mid-morning, St. Peter's Square had transformed into a living cathedral. The ancient cobblestones gleamed under a gentle Roman sun. Thousands of chairs had been arranged in meticulous rows. Beyond them, a sea of pilgrims stretched all the way to the barricades. Matteo stood at the third position left of the papal platform, halberd vertical at his side. From his vantage point, he could see almost everything. Cardinals seated in velvet-lined chairs, security blending into the architecture, and the press corps clicking lenses into place. A young girl in the front row waved toward him. Matteo didn't blink. Somewhere above, the Sistine Chapel choir rehearsed. Their warm-up notes drifted into the square like ghosts. A minor harmony, sharp, precise, then silence. This was the first public appearance of Pope Leo XIV since his election. The world's eyes were here. For the Church, this was more than ceremony. It was transition, a transfer of weight, a passing of spiritual architecture from one set of shoulders to another. At precisely 10 a.m., the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang 12 times. The gates opened. The procession began with measured solemnity. A line of altar servers, all in white, moved slowly down the steps, bearing crosses, candles, and incense, their steps timed to a rhythm only they could hear. Behind them came the bishops, robes fluttering, faces serious. Then the cardinals, each a flash of red against the marble, walking with the deliberateness of age and power. Their faces were unreadable, their hands folded, their eyes shielded beneath ceremonial mitres. And then came the man, Pope Leo XIV, emerging not with fanfare, but with the soft pressure of silence collapsing inward. He wore the white cassock, simple, unadorned. No cape, no crown, no gold. On his feet were the same scuffed brown shoes he had worn on the balcony during his first appearance. A gift from a shoemaker in Sao Paulo, he'd once said. His hands were bare, his expression serene. But what struck Matteo most was the way he walked, not like a man ascending to power, but like a priest walking through his parish, familiar, unhurried, unobstructed. The crowd's reaction was mixed. There were cheers, yes, but also long, confused silences. Some applauded, others only watched. Matteo saw one cardinal lean toward another and whisper something, lips thin with disapproval. Matteo's eyes tracked the Pope's every movement. Flanking Leo were two members of the gendarmerie, Vatican security, dressed in black suits, earpieces visible. They moved half a step behind him, scanning the crowd without expression. Every 40 or 50 steps, Leo nodded gently to a child, or paused briefly in front of a wheelchair. These weren't staged moments. They were natural, human, and that was part of the problem. The Vatican liked its ceremonies controlled, scripted. Leo, intentionally or not, was playing a different melody. Matteo felt it like a tremor beneath the marble. Not instability, something else. He looked across to the fourth rank. Lieutenant Deg Greif stood exactly where he should be, back rigid, face unreadable. A row behind him, Stein looked faintly pale. The poor kid's first public formation, and on a day like this. The procession neared Matteo's position. The Pope was now less than 10 meters away. Matteo's halberd, now gleaming in full sunlight, caught a brief reflection of the white cassock. No one breathed. Camera shutters fluttered like soft applause. Somewhere in the crowd, a baby cried and was quickly hushed. The Vatican's internal clock ticked forward. Everything was going exactly according to plan, at least for the moment. Pope Leo XIV had just passed the front row of dignitaries when the man moved. It happened so fast that at first Matteo didn't register what he'd seen. Just a flicker of motion in the corner of his vision, slightly too fast for the controlled atmosphere of the square. The man, short, wiry, mid-40s, stumbled forward from the edge of the press zone, bumping past a barricade and into the open procession path. A Vatican police officer nearby turned, startled, but didn't move. One of the gendarmes stiffened, hand moving toward his earpiece, and then the man reached into his coat. That was the moment Matteo moved. It wasn't a decision. It wasn't thought. It was instinct formed not in that second, but over years of training, repetition, restraint, and one buried memory of standing helpless as someone he loved suffered because no one had acted in time. He took 2 steps forward from his post, cutting cleanly across the ceremonial boundary with a single word, firmly, "Halt." The square inhaled. It was not a shout, but the firmness of Matteo's voice cut like a whip across marble and memory. The sound echoed louder than it should have. A child stopped crying mid-breath. A camera clattered to the ground. The man froze, startled, hand still partially inside his jacket. Matteo extended his left arm, not touching, but halting. His right hand slid lower on his halberd, adjusting grip for leverage. The weapon, ceremonial or not, could drop a man flat with one stroke of the shaft. "Step back," Matteo said. voice lower now, but no less steady. Security finally surged. Two Vatican officers swept in from behind the Pope, pinning the man's arms and pulling him away from the path. A third seized the bag he carried. Another guard reached Matteo's side, whispering sharply words Matteo didn't register. The man was shouting something in Italian now, confused, panicked. "I'm press! I'm press! I was showing my ID!" The Pope had stopped. He stood calmly a few paces away, not alarmed but observant, watching the moment unfold, as if from a great distance. Cardinals turned in their chairs. The choir had fallen silent mid-note. From the crowd came the first murmurs, like a growing breeze before a storm. Matteo didn't move. Not yet. Only when the intruder was fully removed from the square, dragged gently but firmly past the barriers, did he take a step back. One, then another. He returned to his position, raised the halberd, stared forward exactly as he had been trained to do, but it was too late. In those 20 seconds, Matteo had done something nearly unthinkable. He had broken formation. In a moment watched by billions, he had stepped forward when every rule demanded stillness. Even if it had been the right decision, even if no one had been hurt, the breach was undeniable. The rest of the ceremony continued, but with a current of unease flowing beneath the ritual. The hymn resumed after a delay. Pope Leo continued forward, expression unreadable. He offered blessings, kissed altars, gave his first public address, smiled gently. But in every camera shot, in every angle, Matteo's moment replayed again and again. The step forward, the outstretched arm, the sharp command. The online clips surfaced within minutes. One was titled, "Swiss Guard Breaks Ranks to Protect Pope Live." Another was, "Pope Leo in Danger." Guards. Sudden move sparks panic. Screenshots were dissected by morning show hosts. Split-second frames analyzed by security experts. Captions debated in comment sections. Some hailed Matteo as a hero. Others mocked him as an overzealous statue come to life. Many asked the same question. Why did the Pope's own security freeze? But inside the Vatican, the conversations were different. Behind closed doors where candlelight still reigned and hierarchy remained ancient. The talk wasn't about heroism, it was about protocol, about optics, about the one thing the Church valued above all else during ceremonies of transition: control. And in that moment, Matteo Zwingli, the stone of Bern, had cracked the facade. Just a sliver, just one step. But that was enough to send tremors through marble. When the final hymn faded and the blessing concluded, the crowd erupted in cheers. Cameras panned across smiling cardinals and waving pilgrims, and broadcasters filled the air with words like historic, humble, and hopeful. But behind the scaffolding of ceremony, the Vatican was bracing for impact. Matteo remained in position until the last note of the organ. His body did not betray him, neither did his face, but beneath the layers of uniform his muscles burned, not from the weight of armor but from the gravity of what he had done. As soon as the square emptied, the shift commander approached him without a word. He tapped Matteo twice on the shoulder, a relief signal. Matteo nodded, turned with precision, and walked off post with the same discipline he'd shown arriving. He was not spoken to for the rest of the day. Inside the guard quarters, no one said his name aloud, but every man had seen it. Every man had watched the step, the break, the ripple. One young recruit, Stein, offered a glance as Matteo passed in the hallway. Not admiration, not pity, just a question in his eyes that didn't need to be spoken. Matteo kept walking. By late afternoon, the world was already chewing on the moment. Clips of the disruption had been clipped, looped, and slowed. Internet headlines mushroomed. Swiss Guard reacts swiftly during Pope's walk. Was there a real threat? Guard breaks protocol. Pope unfazed. Who was the intruder? Hero or overstep? Vatican insider raises concerns. The man in question was identified within hours. A freelance photojournalist from Florence, recently approved for press access. His record was clean, his credentials valid. The item he had reached for, a press pass, tucked into his coat lining. No weapon, no ill intent. Just poor timing, poor judgment, and a movement that looked far too much like something worse. He was released by evening, but Matteo's action couldn't be undone. Inside the Vatican Secretariat, responses were drafted. Not press releases, internal memos, the kind that circulated in Latin, the kind that never made it past stained glass. Cardinal Gregori, prefect for pontifical ceremonies, reportedly referred to the event as a visible fracture in sacred performance. Someone overheard another official use the phrase liturgical contamination, but the commandant said nothing, not officially. That silence, Matteo knew, was not neutrality. It was weight being measured. By sunset, no order had come. No summons, no scolding, no formal notice. But Matteo knew it was coming. It always did. Just like his father's tailor's shears, quiet, sharp, and inevitable. He returned to his quarters just before Vespers, unbuckled his armor, wiped down his halberd, set everything back in its place with the same precision as always. The ritual calmed him more than prayer. Outside, the city buzzed with the last hours of daylight. Tourists ate gelato near Castel Sant'Angelo. Pilgrims clustered around fountains. Somewhere, a guitarist played a mariachi in the key of longing. Inside, Matteo sat on the edge of his bunk, back straight, eyes on the opposite wall. He felt no regret. He had broken formation. That was true. But he had done it because the line between ceremony and danger had blurred for one breath of time, and no one else had moved. So he had. What came next he could not control, but he would face it, standing. It came the next morning. A sealed envelope slid under his door. Heavy parchment, no markings, but the crest of the Pontifical Swiss Guard pressed into the wax. He opened it without ceremony. One sentence. Report to the commandant's office at 08:45 in full dress. He had expected it, but something in his chest still tightened. Matteo arrived precisely on time, breastplate polished, boots aligned to regulation shine. Halberd left at the door as protocol demanded. He knocked once, firmly. Enter. The room was colder than usual. Commandant Alrek sat behind his desk, hands steepled, expression fixed in granite. To his left stood Archbishop Tremblay, secretary for papal protocol, a man Matteo had rarely spoken to, pale, sharp-nosed, wrapped in layers of silk and authority. And on the far wall, arms crossed, stood Cardinal Gregori, the prefect, one of the few men in Rome whose frown could silence entire corridors. No introductions, no prayers, no preamble. Alrek gestured to the chair. Matteo sat. The silence was surgical. Then, without looking up, Alrek began. Yesterday, during the Holy Father's inauguration, you broke formation. Yes, sir. You deviated from the ceremonial line. Yes, sir. You addressed a civilian. Yes, sir. You crossed a secure path and raised your arm in a command gesture, all of which were outside your assigned duties. Yes, sir. Why? Matteo's hands rested flat on his thighs. His voice was calm, but not mechanical. I perceived a threat. Security did not move. I acted to shield the Holy Father's approach. You are not assigned to protection detail, Tremblay said sharply. I'm aware. Then you exceeded your jurisdiction. the archbishop continued, and in doing so, you compromise the flow of liturgical protocol. You introduce disruption into the most sacred public act of this papacy. Cardinal Gregori stepped forward. "Do you realize what you risked?" he asked, his voice smooth but cutting. "Had cameras caught that man falling, bleeding, struggling, do you know how that would have looked? You're not a police officer, Zwingli. You are a symbol. That uniform is choreography." Matteo's gaze didn't waver. "I did what I was trained to do before I wore the uniform." Gregori's lip twitched. "Then perhaps you should return to that training." Ulrich finally raised his hand, palm open, an old signal between commanders and men. The room settled. After a long pause, he spoke. "We are not questioning your intent, Zwingli. But intent does not insulate action. There are forces at play here you do not see. Hierarchy, order, optics. The Holy Father was never under threat. The man was press." Matteo responded evenly. "I didn't know that, and neither did anyone else." "Precisely," Tremblay said, "which is why it was not your decision to make." Another pause. Gregori stepped toward the window and looked out over the Vatican gardens. "You've served 13 years. Flawless record. Commendations from 4 visiting heads of state. Not even a reprimand for lateness. But what you did yesterday," he exhaled. "You exposed an internal hesitation. You made visible the hesitation of others." He turned slowly. "That is more damaging than failure." Matteo let the silence settle, then spoke quietly. "If you ask me to apologize, I will." "No one is asking," Ulrich said. "Not yet." Gregori folded his arms. "If this were 10 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be gone quietly, discreetly." He looked at the others. "But this pope has his preferences." That was the first time anyone in the room said it plainly. This wasn't just about a guard breaking formation. It was about a pope who had unsettled the foundations of ritual. A pope who walked among the poor, who spoke unscripted, who broke ranks in his own way, and who perhaps saw something in Matteo's action that echoed his own choices. "Until further notice," Ulrich said, closing the folder in front of him, "you will remain on restricted ceremonial duty, no formal disciplinary action, pending internal review," which Matteo knew was Vatican speak for, "We'll wait and see if this blows over." He stood, saluted, turned, and left without a word. Outside the door, the hallway felt brighter than before. Sunlight filtered through stained glass saints, bathing the corridor in fractured color. He walked slowly, letting each step fall with purpose. If yesterday had left a crack, then today confirmed it. And yet he felt no shame, only clarity. The summons came just after Compline. Matteo was in the chapel alone, polishing the brass edge of his halberd in silence, when a junior aide entered quietly and stood at the rear. No words, just a glance. Matteo nodded once and stood. He followed the aide through corridors rarely walked in silence, past papal antechambers, velvet-draped thresholds, portraits of popes whose reigns stretched centuries into memory. They emerged into the Vatican gardens, quiet under the stars. Pope Leo XIV was waiting near the fountain alone. No guards, no advisors, no protocol. He wore a gray wool sweater over his white cassock and held a small wooden rosary in one hand. His shoes, those same worn brown ones, rested half in shadow. "Matteo," he said gently, like someone greeting an old friend rather than a soldier. "Your Holiness," Matteo replied, bowing. Leo didn't ask him to rise. He didn't need to. The air had shifted. This wasn't a reprimand. This wasn't ceremony. They stood together in silence for a moment, the only sound, the slow ripple of the fountain behind them. "You caused quite a stir yesterday," Leo said at last, voice low. "Yes, Your Holiness." "They're debating terms like decorum, optics, and overreach," the Pope continued. "But no one is asking the only question I care about." He turned to face Matteo fully. "What did you see?" Matteo, he didn't pause. "A man who moved too fast, who reached inside his coat. Security didn't move. I did." Leo nodded slowly, considering. "You know, I once had a young priest in Brazil step between me and a machete." Matteo blinked. "He wasn't armed. He wasn't fast, but he was brave," Leo said. "He stopped a boy from making a mistake he would have regretted for the rest of his life." He looked upward, eyes catching a sliver of moonlight. "They told him he violated parish policy, said he acted outside his station." He smiled faintly. "I ordained him the next year." Matteo didn't speak. He wasn't sure he was meant to. "I saw the footage," Leo said, "from 5 angles." He let the sentence hang. "You moved like a man who had done it before, but also like a man who didn't want to." "I didn't," Matteo said. "But no one else did." Leo chuckled. Not mockery, but quiet appreciation. "They're not going to punish you," the Pope said. "Not formally." "I know, but they won't forget it either." "I know. That, too." The Pope stepped closer, his voice lower now. "There's something dangerous about being first," he said. "You weren't the first guard to see something. You were the first to move." He paused. "Sometimes that's all it takes to remind an institution it's alive." Matteo looked at him not with defiance, but with something harder to define. Trust, maybe, or respect. Leo placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "I won't protect you from whispers," he said, "but I will protect your place here. You acted not for show, not for ambition, but for something older, something sacred." He stepped back and began to walk away, rosary swinging gently in hand. Then, without turning, he added, "You'll return to full ceremonial duty next week. I have already signed the order." Matteo nodded once, unseen. "Thank you, Your Holiness." Leo didn't respond. He didn't need to. He disappeared down the path into the garden shadows, his figure growing smaller beneath the moonlight until even the scrape of his worn shoes was gone. Matteo stood alone by the fountain, and for the first time since he'd stepped forward, he allowed himself to breathe. Not like a man who had been spared, but like one who had simply done what needed to be done. Was Matteo right to break formation even though it wasn't his role? If you were in his place, surrounded by protocol, tradition, and silence, would you have stepped forward? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, make sure to hit the like button and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. We post every day, and each story dives into the hidden moments of duty, honor, and sacrifice. Share this with someone who still believes loyalty doesn't always mean standing still. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another unforgettable tale.